Hello, I'm Brian Hubbard.
And I'm Lynne McTaggart.
And we are What Doctors Don't Tell You. And welcome to this, our latest podcast and vlogcast, where we talk about some of the interesting news that's been happening of late, which we thought is worthy of comment. And without further ado, let's go to our first item, which was quite a major report. And interestingly, badly reported by all the world's media, because the world's media came out with a story that SSRIs, the most common form of antidepressant drug, actually help with anxiety, missing the entire story, which was that SSRIs don't work and they don't help treat depression. And this is a major study that's been carried out, and where they looked at the world's most commonly prescribed antidepressant called sertraline, which is marketed as Zoloft, and they found that people with depression only reported a 5% improvement after taking the drug for 6 weeks, compared to a similar group who were given instead a placebo. Well, 5%, as the researchers say, is so negligible that it's hardly worth recording. And the researchers from University College London said they were shocked and surprised by the findings. I think quite an interesting point about this study is it's one of the very first that's been carried out without the funding of a drug manufacturer. So it was a truly independent study into SSRIs and found that they actually don't work, which is not really a great surprise, because the whole theory behind why they should work, which is that we have sort of serotonin being a chemical in the brain that lack thereof causes depression, has never been established by anybody. And in fact, the Psychiatric Association of America has even walked away from that theory and said that serotonin has absolutely nothing at all to do with depression. Nonetheless, people are prescribing them as if it's going out of fashion, and the sales by 2023 are estimated to reach nearly $16 billion a year. So a popular drug that doesn't work, Lynn.
Oh, add to, join the club. But, I mean, SSRIs for such a long time have had so much information, negative information, that has been completely ignored by the medical community. We go back to the beginnings of Prozac, when there were so many reports of people either killing themselves or killing others. And one of the most amazing stories, I mean, a lot of them were very, very violent reactions. One woman actually took bites out of her mother. Is that kind of crazy violence obviously doing something drastic to the brain? And as you say, Brian, I mean, the big problem with SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
Correct.
That's what SSRI means. Is supposed to slow the reuptake, the removal by the body of serotonin, and therefore the assumption was that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin. That has never been proved, and nor has it ever been proved, as you say, that the drugs really work. But there's been such a flood and such a positive PR campaign surrounding these drugs that the regular medical community has ignored so many of the studies about it, so many of the case reports about it, and even black box warnings saying, don't give this to young people.
Right.
It increases suicide. Right. So I'm glad to see that the first independent study, Brian, finally says this stuff is rubbish.
And of course, the sales have been buoyed over the years by positive drug trials that have been paid for by the manufacturer. And as I say, one of the first out of the box that's independent found, as we've said for many, many years now, that SSRI antidepressants don't help with depression.
Absolutely. And there are so many other things that do. I mean, we have a story in a magazine, one of the issues just a few months ago, basically by a psychiatrist saying there's no such thing as mental illness, and that most things like depression respond really well to fixing biochemical imbalances in the body. And big ones that help depression are B6, vitamin B6, magnesium, and zinc.
And then you saw positive effects that have been reported have usually been actually a placebo effect. And the positive benefits have lasted for about 4 weeks. But in this particular study, there were no benefits at any point, and people's depression wasn't helped even in those first few weeks at all. So, there we are. I mean, back to the drawing board for the drugs industry, although probably not actually, because with sales still projected to hit 16 billion in a couple of years' time, I guess, doctors will carry on prescribing it.
And as you say, the mainstream media, they want to talk about amazing conventional drug breakthroughs. And so they've given this negative drug story a positive spin. And that's probably one other instance of the fact that you're not going to get the real story from the newspapers.
Around about 8 years ago or so, Australian government commissioned its Health and Medical Research Council to do a review of homeopathy. And this went on for several years, and the report was ready by about 2012, but then was suddenly suppressed. It was never, ever published. And the researchers who were working on it were dismissed, and a new research team was replaced them. And then finally the report, or a new report rather, saw the light of day in 2015, and no great surprise, it utterly dismissed homeopathy, so there was not a single shred of evidence that it is effective for anything. But someone had told a story that the original report actually had found homeopathy did work. And this was in Australia, so the Australia's Homeopathy Research Institute started a campaign to get the original report published. Well, last week they succeeded, and the NHMRC were dragged into releasing this report, which, lo and behold, discovered that indeed homeopathy can work for a range of conditions, including fibromyalgia and otitis media, and also help with the after effects of cancer treatments. And they said there was fairly good evidence to support that it was, they said it was encouraging evidence that homeopathy was effective for those conditions, as well as a thing called post-operative ileus, which is a blocked intestine, and even the common cold it can help with. Well, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because the NHMRC sat on this for about 5-6 years and refused to and they also refused to release it despite freedom of information requests, and even the Australian Senate commissioned them to release the report, which they failed to do. So finally the report is out, and yes, there's pretty good evidence. It was 55 studies were examined, and I said the original researchers who were sacked for their hard work found that it was this encouraging evidence there all along. So homeopathy actually does seem to work, Lynn.
Well, this is not a big surprise to me, but it's just more evidence of the conventional bodies trying to do whatever they can to stifle and kill off homeopathy. This isn't the only government report that has demonstrated efficacy. I mean, some years ago, the Swiss government wanted to evaluate homeopathy to see whether or not they should include it with their National Health Service. And so they did an exhaustive report and again found that homeopathy works for certain conditions. Now, it may work for more than this, but this is all that's been tested for with credible studies, credible, well-designed studies. However, in many, many other countries, and Australia was one of them, Britain is now, there are skeptics trying to force the government to remove homeopathy from the National Health Service and to close down a homeopathic hospital, etc., even though our royal family swears by homeopathy, as do millions of people. But it's really forces at work, not necessarily lack of evidence. And the big problem everybody has with homeopathy, of course, Brian, is they can't figure out how the darn thing works.
Right.
Now, that is true if you take a very materialistic view of science, the Newtonian view that things are separate, well-contained objects, and that they don't influence each other in subtle ways. But if you look at some of the evidence of the late Jacques Benveniste, he demonstrated that water has essentially a memory. And this has been verified by a number of scientists in Italy and also by the co-discoverer of the HIV virus, Luc Montagnier, who has been investigating properties of water and found essentially water is like a tape recorder. So if you put a substance in and you remove it and dilute it, as you do with homeopathy, what they do is they'll put a substance in, some original substance, like, say, arnica, and they will then dilute it and dilute it and dilute it until there's no actual molecule left of that substance. Nevertheless, it has essentially its energetic footprint. And these scientists, credible physicists and biologists, have found, yes, this is true. Molecules of water coalesce around these kinds of other molecules and essentially tape record it. They create what they call coherent domains around it. So there is a lot of science to support it. You just have to not look at the gross world of matter that we've described by 17th century physics, described by Newton, but look at the more modern science of the quantum world, and it all makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and this is worth mentioning. I mean, we look at our little restricted world here, but in India, it is still one of the major medicines, and I think it happened after about 1850, when it treated a massive cholera outbreak, and so yes, I mean, obviously a lot in it, and well done, the Australian homeopathic groups, for getting the report released. Yeah.
Now, there was a big movie about this, wasn't there?
Well, yes, there was. Just a Drop, I think. And it did refer to that. But of course, at that time, they didn't know what was going to happen with this report. But they do refer to the fact that there was this evidence out there that had been suppressed. And it was quite conspiratorial. I mean, what some of the theories going around, but certainly the researcher was taken off the case, and a whole new team were put in place, and completely reversed pretty much the original findings. So yeah, interesting stuff. Thanks, Lynn. HRT, hormone replacement therapy, prescriptions have been on the rise in the last 10 years or so. There have been lots of positive studies coming out saying how effective they are and how they help women overcome the worst effects of the menopause. And, it seems like everyone suffers short-term memory loss, because go back to the 1990s, early 1990s, the Women's Health Initiative was discovering that HRT was increasing the rate of breast cancer, and I think a few other cancers beside, and I think heart disease. I think it was a series of reports came out that long ago, and it pretty much stopped HRT in its tracks for several years until, as I say, these positive reports started to come out and people started to forget and all the rest of it. Well, there's been another independent study into it, quite an exhaustive one, carried out by Oxford University. which has found that HRT is twice as risky as doctors have been told, and certainly as according to a number of so-called authoritative medical sites, which have all been given HRT the clean bill of health, is twice as risky as they thought, and they now reckon that HRT is directly responsible for 1 in every 20 breast cancer cases. And the greatest risk is for those who are taking the most common form of it, which is the estrogen plus progestogen. If it's taken for 5 years or more, it's going to increase the risk for breast cancer quite dramatically. In fact, they reckon that, and that risk carries on rising the longer you take it. And simply, the risk is slightly less with the estrogen-only form, they say, but nonetheless is cause for considerable concern. And the researchers say it really is time that women were told, look, there's a real risk with this stuff, and that you should be aware of it before you decide to take it. And, and furthermore, I would say that under informed consent, which, yes, folks, is actually a legal requirement of your doctor, is that in getting informed consent before you start taking a drug like HRT, you should also be told all the other things that you could do as well, and then determine which course of action you want to take. So, and maybe it's time this was brought back because, as I say, HRT twice as risky as they thought.
This is outrageous, Brian, because, as you say, the largest trial ever conducted about HRT in the 90s, the Women's Health Initiative study of hundreds of thousands of women, demonstrated without a doubt it increased the risk of breast cancer and other illnesses as well. Heart disease, I believe, was one of them, when the whole spin on this drug had been that it was actually protective of heart disease. So they stopped. It was so dangerous, was it, that they stopped the trial. And the interesting thing was this material, which was there with all of these, records, was a great source of research for other scientists who are looking at other aspects of it. For instance, one study I know of that was really interesting was looking at whether or not you were more predisposed to breast cancer because of a familial history of breast cancer. And they thought they would find that when they combed among these hundreds of thousands of people, and they didn't. What they found was the only indicator of increased risk was whether or not you took HRT. So this is a scandal that the drug companies have put a positive spin on something that we knew 20 plus years ago was causing breast cancer. And we have better alternatives. But also, this also beggars the idea that we absolutely need this kind of independent study of the pill. Because the pill is HRT in another form, essentially. It's, estrogen plus progestogens, basically. And that needs to be studied too, because we're giving that to young women and wondering why breast cancer among young women is skyrocketing.
Well, I think it was a damage limitation job by using the facade of science to reassure people that HRT was safe. And again, like an earlier story we talked about with antidepressants, that again, the positive studies have invariably been paid for by the manufacturer who stands to benefit from it. And again, it underlines the importance, I think, of independent medical studies, because unless we have those, we're not really going to get to the truth. Instead, we're just going to have spin that benefits the drug manufacturer and boosts his profits, but it doesn't help the people who are taking the drug.
No, and the biggest outrage of all is that we're talking about generally healthy people, healthy women who are going through a natural process and having some side effects and having some effects as that change goes on that can readily be treated by homeopathy, by herbs, and by other natural substances, vitamins and other supplements so you don't have to resort to a drug.
Right. Thanks, Lynn. 5G, the great new mobile cell phone network, is starting to roll out, and already there are people who are objecting to it, including, I understand there have been protests around the planet, and the most recent that I'm aware of was in Bern in Switzerland quite recently. People are very concerned because of the cancer risk, because no one's tested for it. And what's going to happen if you do get cancer from the 5G network? Well, don't go to Lloyd's of London, the world's largest insurer, because they are refusing to allow any any claims on it. They're not going to pay out anyone who's got 5G cancer. Tough. They're not going to pay out, and people could argue, well, obviously they won't, because there's no evidence that it causes this problem. So why should they pay out? Well, interesting question, but the reason why is because Lloyd's has already carried out its own risk assessment, and it concluded, fascinatingly, in 2010, that wireless networks, Wi-Fi, and this is before 5G, mind you, but nonetheless, wireless networks, cell phones, you name it, are similar to asbestos, which was the great health risk, building material which causes lung disease and cancer, first recognized in 1920 that it could cause this problem. And the asbestos industry refused to move on this. And it was only in the last, 20 years that they accepted asbestos caused this problem. Well, Lloyd's of London, the risk assessors, have drawn a similar line to asbestos with 5G and cell phones. In other words, what are they saying? They're saying that the mobile phone industry is just like the asbestos industry, that in fact this risk is there, that they are not recognizing this risk. So Lloyd's are saying, we don't want anything to do with this. Furthermore, they're saying to people who use their policies, complain to the schools, go to the churches, because it's the schools and the churches where they're putting up the masks and making a lot of money from it. But don't come to us at Lloyd's, because we ain't going to pay out. Not because we don't believe it's a valid health claim, but we don't want anything to do with it, with an industry that's walking away from this.
This is very scary, Brian, because this is the problem with Wi-Fi. There are only a few canaries in the mine who are screaming about this. There are lots of people protesting, but the people who are looking at this scientifically, like George Carlos in America, are few and far between. In governments, enthusiasm for the amount of money they get from the wireless and the cell phone industry, they're jumping onto it because they get, it's very lucrative for them. But as we know personally, when they tried to put a cell phone tower essentially across the street from our daughter's bedroom, we got our neighborhood together and we successfully protested. But we couldn't argue on health grounds. That was the problem. We had to argue. We had to study the law and argue on essentially on aesthetic grounds, that this was going to block our sidewalks, this was going to be unsightly in our neighborhood, and that kind of thing. And we prevailed twice. But we couldn't argue on health grounds because no one is doing this.
No.
People are not asking. And they're not just asking what happens to people and children, adults and children. They're not asking what happens to animals. There are some quarters who believe that the diminishment of the bee population hasn't just to do with pesticides, possibly also Wi-Fi, similarly with birds. So we need to ask these questions. Just as we need to look at climate change, this is another big question. While the internet has transformed our lives, we can't do it at cost to our health.
No. And it's interesting. I mean, there are a number of scientists who are concerned about this, and they're calling on governments to take the cautionary approach, as it's called, whereby you prove something is safe before you roll it out, rather than roll it out and then discover it's dangerous, which seems to be rather more sensible. But anyway, Lloyd's of London is taking the lead on this, and it's just like the asbestos industry. Okay, well, we're all different, aren't we? Although we're all given the same drugs, but each of us is actually different, and we all have different manifestations of problems. But also, we're all different as we get older. And the gerontology, the study of old age, tells us that, in fact, as we do age, our biology changes and our needs change. And for example, we need loads more fats when we get older because fats help feed the brain. With lots of fats, we ward off things like dementia and Alzheimer's. But not that doctors would believe that, because they still believe LDL cholesterol, one of the essential fats in our body, should be removed because it causes heart disease. But as we get older, we actually need it. And just to demonstrate that, a new study has come out demonstrating that the more eggs and meat we eat, the less chance we have of developing dementia when we get into old age. And the longer we eat these things, the better off we're going to be. So starting off at the age of 42 and eating this for 22 years, according to this study, you're much, much less likely to develop dementia. In fact, they say the results are, quotes, significant. So fats are good for you, and they are even better for you when you get older. So what do you reckon, then?
Well, everything that they've been telling people about cholesterol has probably contributed to the huge rise in dementia that we've seen in the last decades. The effect of cholesterol-lowering drugs, which are always given to the over 55 almost automatically, must be devastating to the brain because it is blocking the very stuff the brain needs as its fuel. So this goes along with so much of the material that we're seeing about paleo-style diets, which is diets that it doesn't need to have loads and loads of meat. It doesn't have to be an Atkins-type diet of the 70s where you've got a giant steak on your plate and that's it. It needs to have a modicum of meat or fish or something like that, but meat in particular, which has some really essential nutrients, and the good fats, which are coconut oil, particularly if you're a vegan, or goose fat, beef fat, lard. All of those kinds of old style fats are really good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it demonstrates that things change. I mean, it's interesting that just as doctors have never studied nutrition, they've also never studied medicine for old people. And gerontology is a really important branch of medicine which is never studied, and yet our needs change as we get older. And speaking as a very old person myself, Lynn, I think we've reached the end of this week's podcast and vlogcast. And thank you very much for your illuminating, as ever, comments, which has made this tatty tapestry into a fine curtain of silk wonderment. So thank you, Lynn. And I will bid you all farewell until next time.
Thanks everybody for listening. Excuse the fly that's been flying around here. He probably wants to hear what doctors don't tell you.
Thanks.